It's 7 o'clock, so I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the Planning Board meeting of April 19th, 2022. My name is Kathy Barnard, and I'm now going to introduce the other members of the Planning Board. To my extreme left, Doug Breskin, sitting next to Doug Von Dugan, Peter Goodwin, and Mike Hodder is the Vice Chairman of the Planning Board. To my right, John Thurston. Brad Harriman is the representative from Board of Selectmen and Planning Board member, and Julie Jacobs, who is an alternate. The first order of business is to hear from Maggie Steer. Thank you very much for coming. And so just why don't we dig right into it?
Okay, great. Okay. I'd like to introduce Ann Blodgett also, who is my wingman, who is also a member of the Heritage Commission. Thanks for letting me come and present to you. I see that you all received your copies of the Charrette Report, which is terrific, and I hope you've had a time to look that over. As you probably know, Plan New Hampshire came to Wolfeboro at the invitation of the town, with the understanding that we were asking them for help, and they were bringing a team to us to provide that help, and that then we would do something with those recommendations, or something to build on that process. And Kathy Barnard and I began the application process working with Matt Sullivan, Tavis's predecessor, I think as early as 2019. We finally applied in 2020. There was a delay. We didn't hold it that year, but we were able to hold it last October. And I hope all of you had a chance to come. We heard from a lot of town staff and a diversity of townspeople. The team then, a team of outsiders with lots of expertise in different fields, synthesized that information for us. Most of what's in the printed report was in the PowerPoint presentation they gave, although I did review that this afternoon, and there were a few additional slides that didn't make it into the report. I want to say that their recommendations are meant to be of a general and overarching nature, just sort of a vision in the 2 days they were here. But implementation is solely in the hands of the community. So I think maybe the best thing to do is just sort of flip through it, and then I'll highlight some of the recommendations. At the end, I'd like to make a request of the Planning Board and get your feedback on how we might proceed. So on page 7, there's lots of preamble, a description of what a charrette is, what the tour is, and what tour we took. And then on page 7, the range of issues and concerns that the town staff and departments wish to bring up, and commissions wanted to bring up. It really covers the gamut from parking to housing, wayfinding, traffic concerns, historic elements. Some of these things may sound very familiar to you. I was reminded that 1996 master plan attempted to resolve some of the issues that are still bubbling up. And then page 8 is what Wolfeboro residents told the Charrette team. And it echoed many of the same themes, but also talked about the need to better accommodate, attract, and retain young families. The affordable housing thing came up in many contexts. And to serve retirees, not only don't price them out, but also more recreational or social activities, particularly of a year-round nature. There's 2 pages of history on the town. This typically doesn't include recommendations, but they snuck a couple in, and I'd just like to point those out to you. They mentioned extending the rail trail all the way to Dockside, which of course is the historic route of the railroad. And And there was one big discovery for me, which you'll see in the Sanborn fire insurance maps illustrated on page 10, and that is that the little municipal electric building, shown in red because it's brick, yellow connotes wood frame, was initially the power plant for the gigantic U-shaped shoe factory that went all the way around it. And you can see the evolution of its use. The big black blob is the coal bins, and in the bottom map, is it the bottom map? No, the middle map, you can see that the rail line was extended to sheds behind the brick building to deliver coal.
Right.
And so when the shoe factory burned, the town had an opportunity then to use that building and added onto it the first time, and then later the second time. The shoe factory was rebuilt and then burned a second time. All of that's covered here. And then I think the other big recommendation was that we do have some wonderfully historic buildings along Laner Street, particularly the town-owned ones, the electric building and the old fire station. And they urged thoughtful consideration for the value of those buildings when planning any new construction. So it was a big team. In fact, this was probably the biggest team Plan New Hampshire Charrette has ever mustered for one town visit, and one of the largest areas they had ever dealt with. So they had 20-plus people, ranging from historic preservationists to planners to architects to builders to traffic engineers and more. People from the state, people from DOT, people in private practice. So they divided up into 4 teams and divided the project area into 4 main components, which are shown on the map on page 11. From downtown along the rail trail and Back Bay being one, the Laner Street area being the second, Wolfeboro Falls retail, although to me that's really Center Street retail. Somehow the Falls to me is further out Center Street. And then traffic improvements on Center Street was the 4th area. They made a lot of observations and recommendations, but what we had asked them to do specifically was to look at, in the downtown area, strengthening pedestrian and vehicular traffic connections, improving the flow of traffic, encouraging alternate transportation, enhancing green space and recreational opportunities, and they felt that additional signage to enhance wayfinding would be helpful. So you'll see all of that in those pages with their recommendations and major headings. They proposed 2 options for the treatment of Railroad Avenue. One would be to close it off to make it a pedestrian plaza with access from Glendon Street, Central Street, and what's that little connector called that goes in front of the train station? That street. The second option would be just to close off one side of the street on Railroad Avenue, and instead of doing head-in parking, doing parallel parking. At the presentation, I didn't get a sense that a lot of people loved either one of those ideas, and I think they would be difficult to implement. But nevertheless, there's definitely merit to that, and that's all laid out on page 13, along with a little schematic of where the traffic flow would be directed, as well as a new pedestrian plaza. The other concept that's worth thinking about is maybe doing this just for some months of the year when the traffic is really heavy, and returning to another traffic flow during the winter months when we have to contend with plowing snow and much less pedestrian traffic. They also recommended, starting on page 14, extending the waterfront trail to the other side of Back Bay and perhaps there's a group in town that might want to look at that and can speak to the fact that the merchants and businesses on the other side of Back Bay would very much like to have their own charrette.
So we're talking Bay Street. So when we sought support and when we were communicating, we learned from Wolf Trap primarily that they felt Bay Street needed its own charrette to connect with a goal of connection somehow, some way, whatever that may be. And so Jim at Wolf Trap has a lot of ideas, and he expects the planning board to help him out, as he thinks it's a prime area for some thoughtful planning.
And I have had some follow-up conversations with him, starting in the winter when he wasn't busy, and now, you know.
Every time I go buy fish, I'm followed up on.
Yeah.
I have a question, is that there's this proposed Greenway, Gateway.
What page are you on, Peter?
I'm on page 13.
Okay.
And how does that deal with the businesses which are in that area? In other words, you have Bradley's Hardware, which is a place where people come and bring and get stuff. They get their propane tanks, and they aren't going to walk through a Greenway, or where are they going to park?
Exactly, and that was a question that a lot of people asked. I don't think the Charrette team felt it was their responsibility to answer it. They were here just to propose ideas, and I don't think in their brief observation and time walking around downtown, they happened to see people loading and unloading propane tanks or putting the compost bags into their car. So I think we all realize that that is a nice idea, but probably completely unworkable for the amount of traffic and business that the hardware store gets. So some of these make a lot of sense. Some of them probably aren't going to be easy to implement or even worth exploring. So thanks for that question. Recommendations again for waterfront improvements and enhancing trails on page 14. Add screening and vegetation to define the park areas a little bit more, including a pocket park in front of the electrical substation. To screen that a little bit more, they proposed a kinetic sculpture of some sort and a little bit more wayfinding so that should people be unfamiliar with town, they might easily know that they could get to public restrooms across Voss Field. They could go buy a pizza, they could get to the liquor store, and they wouldn't have to take a car. They could walk. Some people already know that, but many people don't. And the addition was, again, in this theory of multimodal transit, add a Dero bike rack. I think that's sketched on the following page. Yes, it's on 15. I'm not familiar with a Dero bike rack, but I guess it's a bike rack that looks like a bicycle. And then a fix-it bike repair station. And again, I think these are concepts that planners use a lot for public spaces. But I think that is not a bad idea and probably not that difficult to fund either privately or through grant applications if that's something that was determined we wanted to add. On page 16, you'll see they suggested replacing the board, which now serves as a bridge across the ditch on the far side of the field, with a real footbridge, and suggested that might be an Eagle Scout project. I loved their sketch. They just sort of drew it over the ditch there, and it looks like that's just what we want. Yes, it does look real. And again, I think that's low-hanging fruit and something that would probably be appreciated and not too difficult to construct. Whether or not we need a wetland permit is beyond my expertise. And then finally, on page 16 on the far right, you'll see a sketch of a little breakthrough connector road into the parking lot of Silva Dentistry to add a loop capacity to accessing the municipal parking lot. So it wouldn't only be accessible from the Glendon Street extension, but one could also get through there. I have no idea what the ownership of the property is there, but it might be worth exploring that.
Yeah, there used to be a road that went around so that you could access both properties.
Yeah, okay. And they said there's a little drainage issue, but that could easily be solved with a rain garden or a culvert. And it would also allow ADA access to the back of the municipal electric building, should that be used for a community center or some other public use. And I think that's a very worthwhile recommendation, given that further on in the report, they do make use of the grade change between Laner Street and the parking lot with multi-level buildings. Any questions about that section before we move to Laner Street? So on page 18, they talk about Laner Street reimagined, and I think the opportunities here really caught the fancy of many of the team. The Girl Scouts came and presented their model and their vision for a community center. We did hear a little bit from HEB engineers, but of course their final report was only made available a week or two ago, so we didn't know the final findings about hazardous materials, lead paint, asbestos, et cetera. But their vision was actually to use the two buildings with a connector that would be back from the sidewalk level and a little pocket park between the two buildings. And as I said before, with access to the back, probably with an elevator to get people up there. They did definitely stress protecting the integrity and character of this mixed-use neighborhood. And because they had heard a lot about affordable housing and shrinking housing opportunities, they did recommend that there be some infill that would mirror what was already there. Small multifamily buildings that fit in with existing character and scale, no large industrial housing. And although they did make reference to current zoning not permitting what's already there, Tavis told me that all recommendations by the Charrette team are doable under current zoning. So while what's there may not be conforming, anything new probably would be possible. The housing recommendations are on page 22. Actually, there's more about the character of the street on 19 and 20. You'll see an interesting computer-generated view at the bottom of page 20 showing the electric building in red, obviously it's brick, and then what is also in red, the Sanold building, with a stepped-back second floor to make its presence on the sidewalk a little bit less strong. And then a few other infill buildings further down the street. Some of you will remember when there were two other houses there and the town purchased those and demolished them because they were in poor condition. So on page 22, the housing recommendations include looking at increased density, which was a recommendation in the master plan, exploring amendments to the zoning, for example, allowing 30 units per acre by right. I don't think that's a worthy example because I think there were earlier recommendations to preserve the character and scale of this street, and I think that level of density probably contradicts that. But you're the planning board and the planning department, so I'm just telling you what the report said. Consider lessening the restrictions for accessory dwelling units, and I know attached ADUs are already allowed, but perhaps detached ones might be considered. And then they talk about applying for a municipal technical assistance grant which is a program of Plan New Hampshire, and it is to allow $5,000 to $25,000 to hire a consultant to look at modifications to zoning and other regulations that would encourage the kind of housing that the town would like to see. Applications are accepted on a rolling basis, and I think it's a pretty quick turnaround. The only issue is that you have to hold off spending any of the money until they've told you that you've received it. It can't be retroactive. I also wanted to bring up, Wolfeboro has adopted the provisions of RSA 79E, which is the Community Revitalization Bill. And Tavis is probably familiar with this, but last year there were 2 new provisions that were adopted. This is a tax relief incentive bill, so people get a reduction in their taxes for making an investment in fixing up the property. But these new provisions would create residential property revitalization zones. I'm going to give you this, Kathy, because it has the technical language. And then a housing opportunity zone. And again, it's tax relief for qualifying structures to support affordable housing.
Right, we did talk to the selectmen about that.
You did talk to them
Yeah,
already?
right.
Okay, I
They
just wanted to make sure you knew
weren't
about
too
that.
interested, but now it will be, I mean, it's another time, so.
Okay,
Try
great,
again.
great. So I think that's all on the housing recommendations. Any questions on that component? So then the third part was connecting Center Street Commercial District to the downtown, including enhancing parking and recreation, maximizing vibrancy and efficiency, improved pathways, and expanding the capacity of the existing parking lot behind Harvest Market. And that might include relocating the playground and expanding the parking lot, as you'll see on page 23, right to the edge of the basketball courts. And then perhaps putting the playground on the other side of the existing restrooms and pavilion building. I talked to Christine Collins briefly about that. She said, yeah, I'd consider that. All it takes is money. So, on page 24, we go to section 4, which is Center Street and Main Street, and the commercial development there, the 2 shopping plazas, the vacant lot that's owned by Paul Zimmerman, the Wolfeboro oil buildings that now are part of Eastern Propane, another gas station, a couple of buildings that have changed hands recently or in the process of changing hands. The sketch on page 24 confused me, and I think it's helpful to know that this was drawn from the perspective of the path at the end of that rec department pavilion. So what you're looking at on the right, the new 2-story building, would replace the old Wolfeboro oil buildings with the gas station behind it. And then the building, sorry, that's the building on the right. The building on the left would be across the street on the Zimmerman lot. And if you look at, did they draw that? No, see, that's another slide that we don't have, I don't believe. I don't think it's here either. Yeah, that's just the back of Harvest Market. But I will make sure you get that other slide because I think it's worthwhile to explore how to make more of the Wolfeboro oil buildings by encouraging new shops or restaurants to keep people in that area a little bit more, to see if there's something that could be done with the Zimmerman lot that would enhance the goals of the Charrette across the street, and to do some traffic calming, adding trees and landscaping that would make that not seem quite so much like a commercial wasteland the way it does now. No offense to anyone, of course, but it's is different from the rest of the character of the town. Finally, the transportation improvements, they looked at both the Pickering Corner intersection and the intersection by Pine Street and Laner Street. The town has already made some improvements there, which are terrific for improving traffic safety. But they, with their traffic engineers, had some fun designing 2 roundabouts for those 2 locations. There, of course, is the Route 28 traffic study that's ongoing. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these recommendations because I think there are other processes in the works for those. I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, there was a committee that looked at the Center Street improvements back several years ago, and we were really concerned about that red building on Laner Street because supposedly it's one of the older buildings in town, and so we were, by gosh, going to save that building.
That was really nice that you did.
Well, thank you.
It's a nice line in the sand, and it protects the integrity of Laner Street
Right.
As you head down the street. So that's great. I just think equal attention needs to be paid to what's going on the other side of Laner Street with the Wolfeboro oil buildings and
right.
et cetera. So but these guys are designers. This Charrette team loved to design things, and they saw an opportunity there and had fun with imagining some changes to it. There was a postscript. Page 27 has another roundabout, and they talk a little bit about complete streets here and making sure there is room for pedestrians and bicycles and vehicular traffic, along with the planting of trees and encouraging people through those means to travel a little more slowly and enjoy the view a bit more. The economic development considerations were presented by 2 of the members who didn't take part in any one of the individual teams, the town planner from Durham and a gentleman who owns a large construction firm. And they both said find ways to be proactive as development pressure and new investment continue to escalate here in Wolfeboro. By that, they meant try to control what's being built so that it meets our standards instead of protracted negotiations and the difficulties that might result. I don't know that the town would consider this, but it suggested that the town could, in fact, buy properties, redevelop them themselves, or place some sort of easement on them and then resell, thereby ensuring that what the town wanted to have happen on that property would indeed happen. The Economic Development Committee might do this. There might be a development corporation that could finance such purchases. So that was the gist of those final thoughts.
Great.
As for next steps, they recommended that we have a forum so that all of the results could be presented and we could get more input from citizens about what comes next. But the Heritage Commission talked about this at our meeting last week, and our recommendation was to ask boards and committees, planning, Public Works, Parks and Rec, Heritage, Economic Development, to review this report, and any housing entities, and make a list of what they would like to do, what they might claim or what they might champion, or just what they'd like to see happen, and then bring that back to the Charrette Steering Committee, and then we hold a public meeting to review those recommendations and the actionable items. This is the chance for us to ask for people who want to volunteer to get involved. And then the third step would be to, or this could be the second step, I guess, ask the selectmen to appoint an implementation task force, much like we have with the master plan, to create a timeline and build in accountability. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Peter, do you want to make a comment on that?
He was all ready to, I could just tell.
Well, one of the things, I guess, that I have heard from some directions is that some of the ideas that came out of this may have been perhaps not the majority view, but the loud-voiced view. And so that, to me, is an issue that needs to be at least understood, and not to say that it's bad, but at the same time, some of these recommendations may just not seem to be really appropriate for the majority. And, you know, I also end up looking at, you know, the dollar signs, you know, in that last thing where you end up having the roundabout down there by Harvest Market. There is the new idea of a new gas station. And, you know, that's in the picture, that's in the diagram, and, you know, the cost of a new gas station, you have to take down the ones that's there, and then you have to put in a new one. It's like, this is a huge cost. Who's going to pay for it?
I didn't realize there was a new gas station. I thought it was existing.
I was looking at it, and, you know,
Okay.
it says new gas station, and it's at a different angle than the
you're
present
right.
one, and,
Yep.
you know, it's like, this is, you know, it's like, is somebody, you know, accounting for any of this? And so some of it sounds very well based in good planning. But there are other things in here which, you know, I think need to be at least downplayed, perhaps. You know, as in the green space in front of Bradley's Hardware is something which is never going to sell. It's not going to happen. You're essentially going to also be getting rid of, what, 25, 30 parking spaces in that process. And so, you know, I think what needs to be looked at, and when it's presented in full to the public, you need to look at what's realistic and what is, you know, total pipe dream.
Well, that's why I thought maybe the committees could help with that. And you've already expressed the opinion from the planning board, I assume, that some of these things just aren't grounded in reality. They're more blue sky visions. And I do think the Plan New Hampshire team is constantly trying to balance practicality and doability versus, gee, we're giving our time to just sort of envision some cool things for a town we don't really know. And
Well-
they're having fun with that, too.
Well, I think the purpose of the Charrette was to put ideas out there. And,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
and, you know, some of these are never going to fly, and other ones, you know, they may not actually end up in the way that it was initially suggested, but they at least are giving direction for people to think about.
And some of the things the town can do, or committees can steer, but some of it is privately owned property, and we can't really control those investments either.
Yeah, like, I'm not sure whether Mr. Zimmerman is excited about having housing on his property, because if he were, it seems like it would have happened, I would think.
That probably is true. Did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that having been involved in planning sessions like this with other organizations, it is blue sky, because some of those best ideas end up being something else or germinating something else or whatever. Just discussion of Railroad Ave. Maybe you do angled parking only on the bubble side, you know? Or the other, I mean, the opposite side, but it's the evolution of ideas that this germinates. That's all I was going to say.
Yeah, and I completely agree with the two items that Peter picked out, of being sort of pipe dream, not realistic. But I think that there's a lot in here that is realistic. I mean, there are some little things that we can bite off, little bridges and little parks, and eliminating a few spaces in the back bay so that it's not parking right on the water, which isn't healthy for the water anyway, that are easy. And then we can work with maybe teams to present ideas to people with bigger properties that are private, so that we can move forward. You know, Wolfeboro Oil, Paul Zimmerman, Jordy, there's a group of them that maybe we can get together.
Brad, what do you think of the idea of the town buying properties and redeveloping and then, or buying them, getting them redeveloped and then selling them? Is that anything the selectmen would think about?
I don't want to speak for the selectmen, but I know we've talked about the idea of the town in properties that we've dealt with taxes and stuff, of not wanting to get into the real estate market and competing with people that are in the real estate market. That should be a private entity doing all that kind of stuff. We felt that that's why some properties we haven't taken and stuff or taken with the idea that we'd turn around and then resell them. So I kind of think that it would have to be looked at case by case basis, obviously, but you got to think too that the time frame it takes for a town to purchase a property like that. You have to, if it's an outright buy, you have to go through a town meeting process with it. How long is the property going to sit out there? Right now properties don't sit out there very long, so obviously things can change as time goes by, but we've kind of found that out with our police station hunt and stuff, that some properties that we looked at and would like to have explored further, were gone by the time we could act on them and stuff. So it makes it very difficult for the town to get into purchasing and then either putting, restrictions on it or actually putting a type of building on it or something like that, then put it back out for sale. You're kind of limiting it that way. My opinion would be that the people, the businesses and the people that have the ideas would be the ones that should buy it and, develop their business plan and put in something that's going to be viable there, and have that choice of what those would be and stuff, rather than have the town really kind of dictate what it would be there. So, in my opinion anyway.
Yeah,
Well, Kathy, I would suggest that perhaps there's opportunity that if there's a specific part of this or a plan that, rather than having the town buy the property and redevelop it or sell it, if we could work with a commercial developer and give them some assurance that if they did something that we wanted, they'd get a fast track to get approvals and whatnot, it might make it a lot easier.
I think we've done too, we've had this, we could put a revitalization zone. I think we've done that in the past. So there's some tax incentives for redeveloping certain areas. I think we've actually done that on Lena Street and some of the areas there and stuff. So, there's ways like that too to promote, some growth there and stuff. So.
Right.
I would like to, beg pardon, echo what both Peter and Vaughn had to say and then turn it into a practical suggestion. If I were running this, I'd go through the Charrette recommendations and extract out all of the pie in the sky, blue sky suggestions, the ones that concern private property, for example, the ones that discuss roundabouts, which is a nice idea and probably won't happen in my lifetime, and then come up with the ones that can be attacked by a combination of town departments and private individuals. Come up with that list and then go after them, rather than present the entire document to each one of your co-respondents and ask them to come up with suggestions about how they could implement portions of the document, present it to them already edited, yeah.
I just don't feel qualified to do that, Mike. I think that's the approach I would like to take. I'm chair of the Heritage Commission.
Right.
I really can't speak for all these other groups as to what they'd like to do and what they wouldn't like to do. I think probably the big stuff, like the roundabouts, everybody's going to say that's a crazy idea. But maybe not. And maybe the Economic Development Committee might say, you know what? Having a loading zone in front of Bradley's would be a brilliant idea. Let's change the parking on that side of the street to parallel parking and have a loading zone in front of the store. They might come up with that. Who am I to say that's not what somebody else might want to work on? The Heritage Commission is not going to work on all of this. That's why I'm here. we will work on things that have to do with preservation of the historic structures and character of the town, but there are other things we're working on as well. So I'm trying to parcel this out and see if lots of people will weigh in and raise their hand and say, we like that idea, we'll do it. Perhaps it would be the garden club, perhaps it would be the Arts Council to say, we'll hold a contest for a sculpture. Somebody needs to coordinate all this, and it shouldn't be the Heritage Commission. It should be a new task force with representatives from your board, Heritage, all these other groups that I mentioned, I think. Do you want to be on it?
No, I was going to suggest that looking at page 2, you have a steering committee, 2 members of the Heritage Commission, Director of Planning, Kathy, Christine, and Denise. They would seem to have the agency over the Charrette's findings or suggestions. They might be the ones to filter out the suggestions, to pass them out to town departments. But I was not involved in this, so I really don't have a say here.
Okay.
That would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
I think that, you know, there are the naysayers who question whether the charrette was even useful at all or whether it was needed. And I think that what really needs to be done is in the presentation of the findings of it, there is nothing which is going to validate their claims. You know, the charrette puts out ideas, and, you know, as Mike says, you know, the pie in the sky stuff probably just should be removed, because you don't want to have people, you know, ranting and raving about how stupid that particular thing is.
Yeah.
And, you know, that tends to turn the tide, and so therefore the other things end up also becoming, oh, that's stupid too. Even though that secondary thing was a good idea, but they're just going to be on a roll and say it's not worth it.
To take a more positive tack, Maggie, on page 22, housing recommendations, increased density, the planning board is working on that issue now. Amendments to inclusionary zoning, we're working on that and others. Lessening restrictions for ADUs, specifically detached. I'm going to present a case later on this evening to push for detached ADUs. So we're working on that. So of those 4 bullet points, 3 of them the planning board is currently working on. So I don't mean to imply that I think this entire document is blue sky. They're definitely not, but it doesn't have as much granite in it as I would like to see.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Thank you for your comments tonight. The things that I think about are focusing on the current realistic visions, and we do know that visions spur other ideas, so that's really why we're here, for the big picture. One of the things that come to mind as a big part of this is your landscaping, and what I think about is that public-private partnership where you can take parts of the town and coordinate with homeowners and start a realistic possible grant program that might be out there, so you could garner funds and start with small areas of town and say you've accomplished something, and some people have something to look back on in that respect, and then ideas grow a little bit more and people feel like that was a good idea. So that's one of the things that I think about. Maybe some of that, maybe there's grant money out there that can do some of these projects. You talk about the building down there where the Wolfeboro oil is. I think one of the things that I think about to spur entrepreneurship is maybe we give the idea of different businesses and styles that might fit that area rather than just a building or, I mean, we want to flush out some concepts and say, this is our so-and-so area. So just having a building and a picture is a great concept. We do know that Mr. Zimmerman's building lot is for sale, so.
It's been for a long time.
Right.
But we do know that there's money coming into our town every day, and and the possibility drives in, and they could stop here and stay. So never say never, because we always know it happens around the corner. The dockside parking consideration, running the walkway down there. I know that we're in the dockside parking lot design phase, and I know that that would be a good thing to bring up to maybe the dock committee and see if any of that design could be coordinated before we finalize a design on that parking lot. That would be my thought there. The density thing in this area, I'm overly concerned about the density of packing in too much in one area. I'm more looking at the balance of the town, how we can spread that density and make it balanced. I do understand that there's buildings down there that could fit a lot more people, but I think it needs to take some careful consideration when you go and do that. I'm concerned about the pulling off the top of the park area, knowing that it's an old dump under there, and we may want to take serious consideration before we think that project through, so that we can feel safe that we're not uncovering something down there. But I think utilizing that other area next to the Fossfield Rec Hut is something we should be exploring for sure, and I just don't know if we do something on one side, it will cause difficulties on the other.
And that would be a good community project.
That would be.
That-
The Boy Scouts walking off deck there. I'm kind of in a quandary there, because we want people to go down a little bit further and head towards the old Wolfeboro oil buildings. So creating this walking area that comes behind the baseball field that runs along that riverway there, I just don't see the draw in that area. I mean, what I would like to see possibly is a lookout maybe where people can pull off the Bridge Falls path and look at the birds or something like that, a little standoff deck maybe. Yeah, or move the walkway down a little bit more into the soccer fields where the kids play and the kids go back and forth, and parents can keep their eyes on them in that respect. But I think in the big picture, I want to protect the businesses that currently exist. And this may help some of the businesses create more traffic, and we support them. Thank you very much.
Julie, did you want to say?
I just really agree with John in the bridge thing. I think there's probably a police reason that there's just a board down there and nothing else. I think it's being kept that way on purpose. It's restricting traffic to certain things. There's been an issue down in that area for a long time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything? Okay, so I think what we should do is, as a group, get to review this, put together our ideas of things that we can do, and you want people to feed it back to you, right?
That would be terrific.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, then I really think we should all put a little thought into it, write down the things you think that the planning board can get involved in, and then we'll put it together and send it on to you folks.
And if there's something that you think another group should get involved in that might not be on our radar screen, please make note of that. As you did, just check with the police department. That's helpful.
Yeah, right, right.
I do want you to know that the land bank has a purchase and sales agreement on the property that Luke Freudenberg was hoping to develop further out along the rail trail. And so there will be a private fundraising campaign for that to conserve that. I think it's just under 4 acres. And that may be added to the park-like quality of the rail trail very soon if that effort is successful. And the other thing I wanted to say to John's point about grant funding, I do know that there are grants to fund this kind of walkability, amenity, social pocket park things. I've been looking at them for a while now, and I think Wolfeboro might very well apply for some of those things to fund landscape improvements, benches, sculpture, accessibility, walkability, all of that. So those are also, I think, fairly easy things to try to go for.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and filling us in, spending time discussing this.
Thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
All helpful.
Well, and I think it's not just the Heritage Commission, it's partly the planning board. It's our responsibility to take these ideas and take the good ones and move ahead with them.
Right, yeah, and we'll put this on, probably not the May, but June agenda. Okay. Bay Street, it's not up to me. I put the, put it forward. Yeah. No, it isn't. Oh, okay. Next item on the agenda is inclusionary housing discussion.
No explosives.
Oh, okay, that was, I picked up the wrong agenda?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, all right.
That was a previous.
Okay, the accessory dwelling unit is the next item, and sorry about that. Okay, Tavis, you had given us a draft of issues that you think that we need to address in the accessory dwelling unit ordinance and some changes. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, what I put together at the request of the planning board was a modification to the existing language, a very simple fix if the board wanted to contemplate a warrant article or similar to move forward with allowing detached dwelling units. So what you received a couple of packets ago, it says for discussion only at the top, was that same language without the strike through with new text. So this for discussion only outlines interior or those ADUs that are currently permitted within or attached via conditioned space to an existing single-family home, making those ADUs permitted by right. That's in paragraph D. And then creating the new paragraph E for a conditional use permit, which would invoke a conditional use permit process for granting permissions for detached accessory dwelling units. The only other minor change...
Does this include existing accessory buildings? That what you're proposing for the detached?
It doesn't contemplate whether it's existing or a new detached structure. This would be any detached structure from the single-family home. Then on the bottom of that page, F6 is a suggested condition that neither the single-family home nor the ADU shall be used for short-term occupancy, similar to that of a hotel or motel. And then on the back of that same page, I offered for your consideration two conditions for detached accessory dwelling units, that being the ADU must be located behind or not forward in the same plane of the front facade of the single-family home. And two, the ADU must be architecturally compatible with the single-family home, including siding and roofing materials, similar fenestration, et cetera. So that's a quick and dirty, one quick fix to move ADUs as we currently think of them to be permitted by right. They would still have the same conditions of approval as they do now with a conditional use permit, but then adding the other paragraph for conditional use permit for detached units.
Okay, and this is all being done in order to address the housing issue?
Yes.
Yeah, right, okay. All right, Mike, do you want to go over, you did some research on this? Would you like to
Yeah,
go through that?
Mike, before you start, I do have copies if anyone needs what Mike's going to speak to on the from other towns. So if you don't have a copy with that, I can hand that out to you.
Yeah, I sent around 2 separate sets of documents. The first was, what I did was I looked at all the towns around the lake. I looked at Alton, Moultonborough, Tuftonboro, Ossipee, Laconia, and Meredith to see how they handled accessory dwelling units, particularly detached dwelling units. I then took their zoning regulations, printed them out, and then had them distributed to every member of the board. So you've seen what other towns have put into their regulations, verbatim. I then extracted the salient points from their regulations in a separate document, sent that around, highlighting the principal categories coming out of those zoning regulations, permitted zones where they were allowed, any dimensional requirements, the number of ADUs allowed if more than one, and then architectural and neighborhood design details if they were specified. And then third, which I have not, I guess did not get circulated around, were the suggestions that I would come up with for detached. So we'll get to that in a second. You have that, Travis? Thank you. What's getting distributed now are my suggestions for regulations to cover detached ADUs if this board decides to go that route. You'll notice, and I mentioned this in a note, that some of my suggestions are already in the recommendations that Tavis has given out to us in his proposed ADU regulation. There are some differences, and I'll go over the ones that I suggest that are not currently in Tavis's suggestion. And at that point, when I've finished that, we can just have a general discussion about whether or not detached ADUs are a good idea for Wolfeboro. Notice, however, that in the initial documentary circulation that I gave to you all, every town around the lake currently allows detached ADUs in varying degrees of regulation. In addition to the requirements that Tavis has in his proposed regulation, I would suggest the following, that ADUs be limited to only one, either attached or detached. You can't get both, you can only get one. So you choose detached or attached, whichever it is you're going to have, but you only have the one.
And that's the statute.
That's the statute, okay. I would allow, and this is a point that Kathy raised, new construction or renovation of existing construction. So if there is a garage on the lot they want to turn into an ADU, detached, they can apply and they can renovate that garage into an ADU. I would ask for a restrictive covenant that the landowner, that the property owner would sign with the town, acknowledging the conditions of approval and acknowledging the zoning regulations, so there can be no misunderstanding on either part that the ADU is limited to the conditions in the conditional use permit that would be granted. I would suggest that we limit the number of bedrooms in either kind of ADU. Some towns limit them only to one, others to two. Nobody seems to limit or to allow more than 2 bedrooms in an ADU. So perhaps we want to put a 2-bedroom limit on the ADU. I would require design harmony for a detached ADU. So if you have a colonial structure and you want to put a detached ADU, we don't have a mid-century design ADU go up on the same lot. But the design, the external design of the ADU look as much as possible like the principal dwelling on the lot. I would require that the detached ADU, where possible, be behind the building line of the principal dwelling. I think Tavis's regulation speaks to that in a degree. If there's to be an access way to the detached ADU, I'd want it to be on the side or the rear of the principal dwelling to keep it out of public view. If there's to be a detached ADU, I'd want the distance from the detached ADU to the principal dwelling to be limited. I believe Meredith limits it to 100 feet. Has to be closer than 100 feet from the principal dwelling. Whatever we want to do, maybe our lot sizes are smaller, but I think that there should be some limitation. The ADU has to be somewhat close to the principal dwelling. Any newly constructed parking for the ADU, if it's required, needs to be behind the principal dwelling or in the side yard. And no additional driveway cuts for a detached ADU. They use the original driveway or somehow link it up to the original driveway so you don't have a secondary driveway cut in. Those are my suggestions if we're going to go for detached ADUs as additions to Tavis's suggestions. But I would argue for allowing detached ADUs in town in addition to the attached. The purpose of allowing ADUs in the first place was to increase the possibility of additional housing in town. Yes, Tavis?
I was wondering on your citing and parking.
Well, you're getting ahead of me. Hang on one second. Okay. The initial purpose, the spirit of the ordinance was to encourage housing. And Tavis has already reported to us that ever since we passed the ADU back in 2017, there have been, what, four requests for ADUs. So clearly, an attached ADU as a solution to a housing problem has not been successful. So I suggest we try detached. Perhaps that will be more interesting to the developers, interesting to property owners, and it clearly is the way that our competing towns around the lake are dealing with the question of ADUs. Sorry.
I was just wondering how one achieves 6 and 2 simultaneously, unless I'm misunderstanding access ways.
6 and 2. I'm sorry, which 6?
Citing and parking, number 6, no additional driveway, but required on number 2, require the access ways to be to the side or rear of the principal building. Is that pedestrian access ways or is that the driveway?
The access way is the way the way I understand other towns are using it, it's the way you get from the ADU to the principal building, if they are in somehow connected by family. Because I guess it would be a pedestrian way.
Just not a curb cut.
Pardon?
Just not a curb cut.
Not a secondary curb cut, no.
I have a question about the idea that there is the idea that the ADU is supposed to be behind the line of the principal dwelling. Now, there's also the possibility to have a garage refit. What happens if that garage is not behind the front line of the principal dwelling?
That's a good question. Presumably the garage will be either on the building line or slightly set back from the building line. There aren't many garages which are in front of the main principal dwelling building line that are in town. If one is in front of the principal building line and they want to turn that into an ADU, then they have to go for variance with the zoning board, don't they?
I guess that's
all
it is a question.
I think the point of discussion that might come out of that, because there are many instances, especially the older properties as you get out into the hinterlands, if you will, where there might be a barn first on the driveway that is the garage, and then way back is a house.
Okay.
So it might be new construction, detached, to side or rear, but existing, so lots of little details to figure out.
Within a few houses of where I live, I can immediately think of 3 detached garages which are in front of
primary residence line.
Well, then maybe this is a work in progress. This is not a
All I'm
final
doing is
issue.
I'm just trying to show that this may be an issue. And
Yeah, we may have to, that may have to get cleared up. My thought was that if they're going to run an ADU on a single lot where there's already a principal dwelling, I wouldn't want to see essentially two dwellings on the same line or staggered one from the other on the same lot. I'd like to keep the second one back behind the front one, the first one. But then again, if that's not practical, it's not practical.
Well, maybe we should put that specifically to new construction. If it's an existing
work.
structure being converted, then it's already there.
That would work.
How many accessory buildings can we have, and does it include a detached garage? Is that included in the number of accessory buildings we can have?
Every lot is allowed 2 accessory structures, plus 1 additional for every 80,000 square feet of lot beyond the minimum lot size required by the district.
Okay, so it sounds like that includes a detached garage.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. Have you given any more thought to how we can define this so that it's not for short-term rentals?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in, Kathy. I believe Meredith, possibly Laconia as well, included in their regulations that a restriction that any detached ADU is not open to short-term rental, and they define short-term rental as less than, and then there's a set number of days in the year.
30 days, I
I'd say it's longer. I think Laconia has 180
100, okay.
total
All right,
rental
okay.
times. But again, I would want us to somehow cover that base, but
Right.
how we work out the details, the length of time is a matter for us all to discuss. The point of my exercise was, besides to make some suggestions about what we could implement, but to get the board to think about detached ADUs as a possible addition to our existing ADU regulation, and then how to protect the town from abuse of a detached ADU for something like short-term rental or for architectural ugliness, whatever, and make sure that they're not available for rent by outside corporations just coming in, buying up properties.
The interesting place that comes up, Kathy, is how you regulate short-term rentals at all. By definition, from the statute, an accessory dwelling unit needs to be a rented unit. It is not an owned unit. The owner of the property has to live in either the ADU or the principal unit, so the other one then becomes a rental. By our definition of one-family dwelling, an ADU does not make a duplex, which just doubles down on the state statute saying that one of them has to be a rental. But it's a one-family rental. Our definition of one family does not have any term to it. You don't have to live there a certain amount of time for it to be a one-family dwelling. It is built as a one-family dwelling. So for the same reason right now, we can't say short-term rentals aren't allowed because our one-family dwelling allows single-family occupancy. The suggestion that I put in there was the ADU shall not be used for short-term or for transient occupancy similar to that of a hotel or motel. I have not run that by council. I do not know if that would hold up. But it is possible if ADUs remained a conditional use permit that be a condition of the approval.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
Right.
So when I read through all the regulation from the state, it looks like we can say that an owner must occupy one of the units.
Yeah.
But could we make it a full-time owner, their primary residence?
If they're an owner, they're an owner.
Doesn't have to be their primary residence?
No, the state law doesn't say it has to be their primary residence. It has to be the owner.
Can the owner end up spending time in Florida, 5
says-
months in Florida?
Must occupy.
So if it says it must occupy, but if they are in Florida for 5 months, they're not occupying.
I guess it depends on the definition of occupy.
Occupy, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for me, it seems
Don't we
occupied
Because
as we're
they could
in
spend
there still,
5
we
months
didn't move out.
They could spend 5 months in Florida, but still have this as their primary residence.
Yeah, don't we require in an ADU, the owner to have his primary residence here as in the principal dwelling? We don't?
When the applicant comes in to build an attached ADU, we have a checklist of questions that we ask him to answer.
Right.
And that's filed with the applicant. All we ask is owner occupied. We don't ask him for how long.
Right, and we did have quite a discussion on
I
that,
think
too.
we did not.
Right, yeah.
Didn't we ask for proof of New Hampshire residency?
Go ahead.
I'm going to, in the statute, 674-72, Roman 6, a municipality may require owner occupancy of one of the dwelling units, but it shall not specify which unit the owner must occupy.
Right.
A municipality may require that the owner demonstrate that one of the units is his or her principal place of residence,
That's
and the
what I thought.
municipality may establish reasonable regulations to enforce such a requirement.
I thought that was in our conditional use permit for an ADU, that that one of the units had to be the principal place of occupancy, a residency, whatever it's called.
Let me look. Oh, it's right in front of you if you have the regulations, other than paragraph E. That's the whole thing.
I guess I would end up then saying there may be some issue with that in that there may be people who, in fact, live half-time in Florida, half-time in New Hampshire, or wherever else, and literally they spend 6 months and 1 day in Florida, which therefore precludes their being, quote, residents of New Hampshire.
Well, let's see what we currently say.
All I'm saying is
Tavis has it.
175-57.1E5. These would be number 5 on the existing conditions of approval under our regulations. The property owner must occupy one of the 2 dwelling units and provide proof of occupancy. The owner-occupied unit cannot be sublet. Both the primary dwelling unit and the accessory dwelling unit must remain in common ownership.
And that's the state reg or our reg?
That's ours.
That's our regs, and
So
that's,
they have to provide proof of occupancy, and they can't sublet. So I suppose you could argue that if Peter owned a house with an accessory dwelling unit, and Peter went on vacation to Florida, he could not sublet the house as a rental.
The sublet ends up covering that because you're not renting out both of them.
Correct. But the ADU could still be short-term. Right.
And Mike, to your point earlier about New Hampshire residency, it's possible that somebody could own 2 houses in New Hampshire, and of course, only one of them would be their primary residence. So I'm
Yeah,
not sure
well, I
that
guess we can't protect
well,
against all
that was,
contingencies.
that was basically the discussion that we had back when we adopted
For the record, the
this.
2 accessory dwelling units that have been applied for since I've been here, when they submitted the application, we verified that the tax card showed that they were the owner, and then I checked with the town clerk, whether right, wrong, or indifferent, to see if they were registered to vote in case the question came up. Because many that have homes in other parts of the state or other states are not registered to vote here, yet they have occupancy in Wolfeboro for a time.
But the sublet is really the critical part, that they're not renting it out to someone else.
Correct, but remember, we can't dictate which unit someone is in. You could have a 5,000 square foot house and a 200 square foot apartment and rent the 5,000.
But they can't rent both of them.
They can't rent both, at least concurrently.
The thing we're forgetting here, and I'm not trying to be critical, is what we always talk about the people who are going to do it anyway. So there's people out there, again, who are going to just do their garage up over the top, knowing that it's, quote, legal, and they're not going to come in and seek out permission.
No, that's true, but, you know, I keep saying that the majority of us pay our taxes, even though there's no guy with a gun standing over us on April 15th watching as we sign it. Most people are honest. Most people do follow the regulations if they know what they are. It's only a few who don't. So you have to write regulations. I think you have to write regulations for the majority of the people, and the majority of the people tend to obey them. That's at least my experience.
I will state again, I think while people might do it anyway, I would rather afford someone the option to do it with a permit especially if someone's going to be renting it or inhabiting it. So at least there is a mechanism to allow it, so they're not inclined to sneak it in, and they get a permit and they do it correctly, so at least the people that are in it are safe.
Enforcement is a separate issue.
Yeah.
Now, I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman today who may decide to speak or not. He had some general questions about development in general with the shoreland regulations. And the neighbor that had a cabin and whether that detached cabin could become an accessory dwelling unit or not, and we worked through that. But he was rather befuddled that someone, this is tangential but related, that someone on a shorefront property could buy a 400 square foot cottage, demolish it, and build a 3,000 square foot home as long as they comported with the setbacks and the area of coverage. But he, with 2.5 acres, could not have a detached accessory dwelling unit. He didn't understand how that was getting balanced out through the regulations.
It doesn't.
So my next question about this is, how do we confront the septic density and when we have no sewer capacity in our sewer circle of homes here?
I don't know if that's inherently related to detached or not detached ADU, because by state law, one accessory dwelling unit shall be allowed without additional requirements for lot size, frontage, space limitations, or other controls beyond what would be required for a single-family dwelling without an accessory dwelling unit. So every lot that you can build a single-family home on can have an accessory dwelling unit right now.
It has to show that it complies with septic loading,
Correct.
Yeah, you have to-
whether it's sewer or on its own private
Right.
system.
Right.
Correct.
That's in the,
So whether Wolfeboro planned for it or not, and probably didn't because this statute came out of thin air for a lot of towns, every lot that you can build a single-family home on, i.e. any lot in Wolfeboro, can have an accessory dwelling unit. It has to prove it has septic, or it has to comport with the sewer connection, but every lot gets it. So tonight is really, does the board want to contemplate or have public discussion on allowing detached or keep it
Thank you.
the way it is?
Yeah, that's really the point. Arguing over the details, and we'll eventually, if we decide that way, thrash them out and come up with a good ordinance. But the question before the board tonight is, do we want to consider allowing detached ADUs in addition to attached ADUs, one per, and if we do, we then proceed to write regulations in accordance.
And John, I guess one concern, building on what you just said, is if we allow the detached ADUs, are we going to get an influx that's going to create a bigger load on the sewer system?
they would have to show that they had permission to impact the sewer system to get a permit. So if you're adding a bedroom, you'd have to pay the fee or get permission from the town.
Well, and one of the things, I don't deal with this daily, and I don't want to step on other departments' toes. I don't know if the fee structure has been augmented to account for accessory dwelling units on the sewer system. It's very clear if you have a vacant lot and you build a new single-family home that you pay a $6,000 water connection and a $6,000 sewer connection. I don't think there's anything formal that describes what happens if you add an ADU.
I think there's a bedroom addition.
Right, but if you have a two-bedroom home and you add 2 bedrooms, are you going up to the 3-bedroom max plus 2 bedrooms, or are you adding the 2 additional bedrooms?
I'm just talking about the sewer fee.
I
You're adding
understand.
2 bedrooms to your sewer fee.
But do you have to pay a new, we're
Yeah.
way in the weeds. What they figured out at DES, for those that are on septic, is each ADU counts as a bedroom and a half. Even if it's a 1-bedroom, for septic loading, it becomes a bedroom and a half. That doesn't mean that everyone has to install a new septic system, but if they're undersized, they at least have to have a plan designed that they call a shelf plan, so when it fails, there's a new system ready to go in that's already been designed.
Okay, so, but we really do need some input from Dave Ford as to, you know, how we're going to deal with the extra bedroom so that people understand it, right?
It is probably overdue, but yes, there should be some input on what the fee schedule is, yes.
Yeah.
Because we can't prevent an ADU anywhere.
Right. Okay.
Our regulations suggest we can, but that's another fix for another day.
Actually, state statute says they have to demonstrate compliance with septic issues, so that may prohibit some.
But if we're simply just considering allowing one or the other, detached or attached, are we actually increasing septic load?
No.
We're not. So we don't really need to have input from Dave Ford at all, because we already have a regulation which allows attached.
Okay, I understand that, Mike.
And so if we
I really
make it-
do.
Whatever, Kathy.
I was just suggesting, I was trying to address the issues that were being brought up.
Oh, but
And I
as-
was suggesting that we could check with Dave Ford. That was all I
would-
was trying to do.
In terms of writing a regulation allowing detached as well as attached, since there's no net effect on the septic load from either, if we increase it, if we add the detached as well as attached, there's no increase in septic load.
Or there's no difference.
Thank you. I'm having a hard time trying to get the thought out correctly.
And Tavis,
you.
right now, we don't allow any of these in the shorefront, and that seems to be not in compliance with the state regulation. Is that correct? Correct. Okay, so we need to correct that.
Yeah, that's why I put it in allowing in all districts.
Okay, there are several definitions that I think we need to look at. The accessory building, dwelling, single family, that one seems to be a problem. I mean, we need to just look at it and see if it needs to be adjusted or not. And we need to somehow or other figure out how we're going to define the fact that this is only for long-term rentals. So the other thing that I think that we need to come up with a draft that's somewhat ready for public hearing and hold a public meeting so that people can come and we can explain to them why we're doing this and get their thoughts. So somehow or other, we've got to put that into the equation. Let's see.
So I have a question, and
Yep.
I thought that it started in the beginning of this, the proposal was to take the conditional use out of attached and just let that be approved by right and make a conditional use for the detached. Is that correct?
And we're going to take that out. That's what the proposal is.
Yeah.
To not have the conditional permit for
the attached, correct.
Yeah.
For attached.
Because we
but
do have that now.
Correct.
Yeah, we do have it now.
So there would be a public hearing for any detached accessory structure with a dwelling.
I almost think we should have two hearings. One for the taking the attached out of conditional use, and the second one, whether or not we want to allow the conditional use permit for the detached. It seems like two different issues.
It could be addressed as two different articles,
That's
yes.
going to be in the ordinance.
Right, but I almost think it's like two separate public hearings, because it's two separate things.
All depends on all depends on how the planning board wants to put it to the vote. If-
Well, we do, all I'm trying to get to is that if we're going to go ahead with this, we really need to bring this to the public before it becomes an ordinance or a public hearing. That's the only thing I'm trying to address. A lot of thought went into not having habitable space in accessory dwellings, a lot of thought. And I don't think we can discount that. And I want people to know what we're doing and why we're doing it. So that's the only way that I will be in favor of.
I would be in favor of doing something before a public hearing as well, just because then we will know what the sentiment is and we can mold
Right.
what we're doing in the right direction. Not that it may end up changing at all from what Mike has produced by his research, but it just would allow us not to have to revise after a public hearing.
Right, and then you go through everything, the fact that everyone in the Lakes region is doing this, and why they're doing it, and all of that. So, I think it's important that we do that.
Any public hearing needs to start with the history of the ADU coming down from the state.
Right,
And then also the history that we keep hearing we need more housing. So those two things have changed since we were trying to keep
yeah,
accessory dwelling units
Right.
off of. So
Okay.
just a little history, I think, should,
So when the state first started talking about ADUs and the new statutes that are now the statutes, there was a lot of discussion about older couples that had a larger home because they had a number of children, and they weren't able, because of the housing shortage in general, there was no place for them to downsize to. So one of the mechanisms was to allow creation of an accessory dwelling unit, whether it's in the house or in the room above the garage, if you will. So I think if you dig into it, many of the towns that allow detached currently are towns that predominantly have detached garages that have said space, and this was a mechanism to allow the detached in an existing structure. Other towns ran into issues where some people would say, well, now I've got to build a garage so I can have a detached ADU. So you run into those little isms. But now with 4 years of experience, 5 years of experience under the statute, I think it's easy to call out what the board is looking for, should you want to move forward after public discussions, et cetera.
One of the things that you brought to our attention was the fact that the reason we don't have attached accessory apartments is because people really react to the doors in between the two units. And people need to understand that's in the state statute. It isn't anything we invented.
Well,
and also the statute allows you to have those doors locked.
no.
Yes, right.
Yes, I think.
You can lock it, yes.
Yeah.
You cannot require it to be unlocked.
Right,
Right,
so that should
Yeah.
remove that issue.
right, okay. Okay,
But many people don't like the idea that somebody's renting a portion of the same home that they're living in. So I think that's why you don't have a lot of people applying right now for the attached.
Right.
okay, comments? John, Brad?
I do like the detached bit. We used to have a lot of guest houses around. It used to be a thing.
Right, and that's
I'm
what-
not
and that's-
opposed to the look
yeah.
or the feel of it.
Right, and that's how all of this no habitable space in dwellings got started, because people apparently thought there were too many of them, and they were adding congestion and things like that, so that's how it all started with the guest house.
Do you remember how long it's been since it was disallowed?
I think it might have been, I don't know, was it the,
I think it's 25 years,
yeah.
potentially 20,
Right.
25 years, yeah.
Right, there was one provision in one of the...
It was a bunkhouse issue back then.
Yeah,
Yes, it was a
right,
bunkhouse issue.
bunkhouses and guest
Yeah.
houses.
And to that point, I think what was happening was some of those bunkhouses is they were being subdivided up, and people wanted ownership of those separate little thingy, which then became its own tax property, carve off the main dwelling, and I think that was a problem also.
Right,
But as you just said, it's 25 years ago. So
right,
maybe it's time to look at it a little bit more.
And those that exist continue to exist. I mean, the people aren't going to subtract them from their properties. There are carriage houses, bunkhouses that are old.
right.
Yes, and in the very near future, I'm going to be having a phone call with a couple that tore down a shorefront property, and it has a bunkhouse on it. But all it says is a bunkhouse. The owner will be calling saying, what improvements can I make to the bunkhouse? Functionally wanting a detached ADU, and I'm going to say, you have a bunkhouse. you have what you have right now. Then it begs the question, because there are, I mean, since I've been here, probably 25 coastal shorefront redevelopments that have occurred that have a bunkhouse or separate room to sleep in.
Right.
But they're limited by the current, restriction on half-bath ground floor, no accessory dwelling units, which was the clear intent of the town, and that's what the regulations state. But there are many starting to raise the question of why can't I make it livable?
So when they do that, how do you uphold the current zoning ordinance and describe to them that's what we have?
I say that's what the regulations say, and you can't be issued that building permit.
Right.
Whether they do it or not, I don't know, because I don't have a mechanism to go check every couple of weeks to see if they're doing something else.
But if they had a kitchen and a bathroom before, they can still have a kitchen and a bathroom.
Correct.
This is how Laconia describes why they have detached, beg pardon, accessory dwelling units. An option for homeowners to offer separate and independent living space for their extended families, or to offer small dwelling units as rentals to offset the expense of maintaining a dwelling. That's the justification that Laconia has put into their ordinance.
All true.
Okay, anything else? So Tavis, next step, can you talk to Laura about the short-term versus long-term?
I can pass the drafted language by her and see if she believes that is just, or ask her for changes.
And ask her to make some suggestions if she doesn't think that it's...
If you look into what I sent out in Meredith, Chapter 2, accessory short-term rentals, short-term rentals may occur for periods of less than 30 days each that shall not exceed 120 days cumulative rental days annually. So that they've written that into their ordinance.
Okay,
That is really hard to enforce.
Well, all of this is going to be hard to enforce. Everything we have is hard to enforce. We have one enforcement agent. But again, we're relying on public agreement to abide by an ordinance. Most people do.
And neighbor complaint.
oh, okay, so next step, you'll get in touch with Laura.
Yep.
You'll get back to us. Do you think that we can plan on some sort of a public meeting in June?
If the board is clear on what they want the language
Yeah.
to look like in June, I don't have any problem having documents ready for a public forum
We
in
haven't
June.
gotten that far yet, Kathy. We don't have language to work with yet.
Okay, well, we do have to make some changes in the definitions. Right? Yes.
Yes, I don't know if it's worth putting the time into modifying the definitions until we get some sense from the public as to how the board's going to go, but I'll have them ready in the wings.
Okay. All right. Any other words of wisdom? Then, so what do you think, that this
My
needs
question-
to be?
What I would like to
put into-
see is, I'd like to hear from the board, whether the board is behind the idea of incorporating detached accessory dwelling units as part of our zoning ordinance, or do we want to stay only with attached? I think that the board ought to make that decision and make that public. And then thereafter, we take Tavis's document for discussion only on accessory dwelling units, incorporate any of the other additional restrictions, which I'd like to see, into that document, and then pass that past the board again for our discussion, and then we have a document that we can then present to the public.
Okay, all right, so.
Before we move forward, Mike,
go
just to come back to something we discussed earlier, in the existing regulation, 674-72, Roman numeral 6, it reads in part, a municipality may require that the owner demonstrate that one of the units is his or her principal place of residence and the municipality may establish reasonable regulations to enforce such a requirement, which would exclude somebody having an investment property and renting only one of them but not occupying the other.
I don't know how one defines principal place of residence, but I will look into that.
Okay.
That is not in the current regulations
No,
at all.
we simply say that they have to occupy it. And that kind of assumes that if someone's occupying it, that's where they're living. If that's where they're living, they're generally living there most of the time.
So prior community experience for me, many municipalities that have, whether they be called tourist accommodation, short-term rentals, accessory dwelling units, or whatever you want to call them, have some version of that paragraph 6. Some municipalities go so far as to say the owner of the property must be in residence at any time the apartment is occupied. That is very difficult to enforce.
That would be crazy.
But if we came up with what it meant to be a principal place of residence, not only do you own it, but you're registered to vote, perhaps your vehicles are registered in Wolfeboro, there can be a checklist for someone to demonstrate that they are a principal occupant, or that is their principal place of residence.
But didn't we talk about the idea that you just can't sublet that piece of that building?
So
I think that ends up making it simpler.
statutory Roman 6 is inferred in the regulations, but it's not called out specifically.
Peter, the difference is that somebody could own multiple residences in New Hampshire and rent out one of them, and the second one, while they occupy it, technically because they own it, it's left vacant because they're living somewhere else.
Now, I don't want to throw another wrinkle into this, but it is possible, as I've lived through it, it is possible for an LLC to own multiple homes in Wolfeboro. And as long as you are a member of said LLC and you're occupying the home, you typically have a corporation owning multiple homes.
Mm-hmm.
So every time, law-abiding citizens aside, every time there's a regulation, I am convinced there are people out there looking for the loophole.
Well, yeah, we've come up
We're
with
not
that.
going to uncover, discover all the loopholes until the regulation is out there.
That's absolutely true, and we remember them, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Because they stand out. Because there are
And
so few of them.
Yes.
I would suggest, based working on Kathy's suggestion, that question of principal place of residence be decided by Laura. Get her advice on that. That would be something that we'd be incorporating new into the conditional use permit.
I think we should go back to our original document that we already crafted as a board here when we had the attached ADU parameters laid out, because we discussed thoroughly an entity owning and occupying a ADU. And I think that's what we specifically said. We wanted owner occupied. And the reason that we wanted owner occupied, because we knew in the things going on out there in the Airbnb world, if it was owner occupied, there was less chance that it would be an unruly household.
Right.
And things would get out of control. So that's why we held strong on that concept. And then the state tried to make it a RSA that allowed 3 ADUs, and then it didn't have to be owner occupied, and that was squashed in the state level. So they tried to expand their abilities, and there was resistance. So I'd rather look at what we drew up already and see what we need to
So
massage.
to that end, what the regulation currently says in Wolfeboro, 17557.1E5, the property owner must occupy one of the 2 dwelling units and provide proof of occupancy. The owner-occupied unit cannot be sublet. Both the primary dwelling unit and the accessory dwelling unit must remain in common ownership. So the loophole in that is an LLC being the property owner. So if it's owned by Peter Goodwin LLC, whoever is Peter Goodwin LLC demonstrates they are the owner. To John's point, we need to strengthen that, perhaps using the statute 674-72-6 to specify that the owner must not only occupy, but make their principal place of residence one of the units.
We discussed that when we were discussing bunkhouses, and for some reason, we decided not to include that allowance, which is why it's not currently in the conditional use permit. So I cannot reconstruct that in my mind, but I think the best thing to do would be to go to ask Laura, can we require some form of proof of principal place of residence, and if not, why? And then also bring up the problem of LLC to her so that she can cover that base, if that's the only loophole that occurs to you. As far as your concern is we're not going to change the wording that's already there. We're going to simply strengthen it for more protections.
The only thing I can think of that would handle LLCs and private ownership is that you would have to prove that you can vote in this town. I mean, that would be the maximum amount of proof.
Yeah, we did talk about that, and why didn't we put that in?
I don't,
Yeah.
Rob was not in favor of that at the time.
Yeah,
and
right.
We discussed having them, requiring them to show proof through driver's license with a Wolfeboro residence address in it. And for some reason, that did not make it in here.
Right.
And the only reason I can think of is that at the time, we realized we couldn't do that.
Yeah, okay.
And actually, my driver's license has a P.O. box address on it.
Well, you have your legal on the back.
I'll have to look.
Yeah, it's on the back of your license. But anyway, you'll talk to Laura about that.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
it's very clear. You statutorily have the ability to require proof of principal place of residence. The question for Laura is, how is that done?
What does that mean?
Okay, then I'd entertain a motion from someone about whether you think we should have, go ahead with the detached or not.
So moved.
Seconded.
What, or, as I said?
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead with it or not?
What you said.
We're gonna look into it further.
Okay, all right.
Let's change the motion. This board agrees that we will include in 175-57.1 accessory dwelling units the ability to have both attached and detached dwelling units, one per lot.
Okay, thank you. Okay, somebody Peter, will you second that?
No, I will not second that because
okay,
the way
all
that
right.
you said it says that we are going to do it.
Yes,
And I think that we want to investigate it.
Want to study
Okay,
it?
then I'll redo obviously, if I...
So it was a motion that the board agrees to investigate, including in 57.1
fine.
provisions for
I'll
attached and
second that
detached.
one.
Okay. Okay, everybody understand the motion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Abstain.
No.
If the
okay,
discussion, if the board is going to go forward with writing a regulation that includes detached, we're not going to investigate whether we should be doing that or not. We're going to be doing that. That's what I thought we would just discussed here.
We discussed having a forum and inviting the public to discuss it before we decide.
And we're going to investigate the parameters required to do that. In other words, I am very much for having detached things, but we don't know the particulars now, and so we just should move to find out what's really needed with a public.
So with the motion as it was voted on, it would be very helpful if each of you that are so motivated could look at the detached ADU suggested regulations that you received tonight, reflect on the suggestions from detached ADUs from nearby towns and the draft that you already have from me. And if you can just say, these make the most sense to me, I can put together a draft based on the feedback I get, come back to the next meeting and say, this is what I heard from you. This is what it looks like when you incorporate this into the current language. I will do it both for those that like to read strike-through and additions, and I will do it with that just accepted as if it's law.
Peter, why don't you make a motion?
Well, we've already made a motion, and there's been a vote taken,
Oh, we're done with it then?
no.
Well,
If somebody
there
wants
was
to
a vote on the
rescind it,
motion.
that's fine.
There was a vote on a motion that the board agrees to pursue provisions, adding provisions to 57-1 to allow for attached and detached ADUs.
Right,
I think there were 4 yeses and
Yeah,
1
right.
no.
One no and one
abstain.
abstain, yes.
Abstention. Good
Well,
enough.
I'm saying what I'm hearing from that, since that provides not precise clarity on what the next step is that people submit which of the conditions, whether it's written or you just pull it out of thin air, could be included. Then that would give some grounds for the next review document. If the board generally likes that, you can move forward with setting a forum date, et cetera.
Okay. You can take the suggestions that I sent around as my, well, I know that.
okay.
You can
all
take
right.
my suggestions as my input.
Understood.
Okay, so you understand what the motion is, what you're going to do next, and we're all set. Okay. On to the next, public comment. Anybody want to address us on any issue? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Daryl Sarver. My wife and I currently own the property at 217 McManus Road, which is approximately 2.5 acres of land, and we are considering a detached ADU in the future. After listening to your discussion, I have a few things that I'd like to ask you to consider in your consideration of this motion. We currently live in our home year-round. The home is actually very large for us. It's actually a 5-bedroom, 3-bath home, and there's just the 2 of us living in it. So our septic has no problems handling it. It was originally built for a larger family and just as a winter vacation property. We have some neighbors around us that live in other states that come up. Some of them come up for the whole winter. Some of them come up sporadically on a weekend here or a weekend there. We've got another neighbor down the road that's almost never in their home. They have an absolutely beautiful home, but they allow their children to use their home several times during the winter as a kind of a ski lodge type thing. One of the things that's special about our town is we have people coming into it and out of it for winter activities as well as summer activities. And one of the things that you're considering on this detached ADU, well, let me back up a minute, I apologize. My wife does not want anyone living in our home, whether they're there for a day or a week or for a year. She doesn't want, even though we have a large enough home and it could be modified to rent out part of it, partially, for whatever term, she does not want anyone living in our home. And I understand that. I understand her perspective. It's our home, it's her space, it's her safe place. And if we do we are getting older. I just got my first Social Security check a couple of months ago, and she's got a few more years. But as the town, I'm sure, I don't know what the makeup is of the entire town, but I'm sure there are a lot of older residents who feel the same way. But at the same time, our taxes are going up. And I've seen it in other states where I've lived where people had to move out of their homes because they just plain old couldn't afford their taxes. And I look at the possibility of a detached ADU as the possibility of a short-term or long-term rental. I could rent it, there's a possibility I could rent it on the weekends for skiing. I could rent it for a week or 2 weeks for skiing families. I could rent it during the summer. I've got a friend who can't find a rental in town at all right now for this summer. She absolutely has looked all over the place. She's going to be staying in one of the little hotels we have in town at $500 a night or whatever it is when they come up because they can't find a summer rental in this town. Excuse me a minute. Back to the screen. So I would request and recommend that you seriously consider that that prospect, that people should be allowed to, especially if they're living in one of the homes on their property that they have an ADU on, that they're given the ability or the freedom to rent it as they see fit, as long as I guess the ordinances within the town, the noise, the whatever is adhered to, and it just doesn't turn into a total catastrophe. You know, no bonfires at 11 o'clock at night, that type thing, which I'm sure is part of your concerns with the detached ADUs. Summer or winter, it seems like the homeowner should be allowed to make that decision. You know, whether they want to, like I said, rent it out for a day or a week or a month or the whole year. And that's whatever benefits them, as long as it's within the ordinance guidelines of the town. Mr. Hodder, you had mentioned that one of the things that you suggested is that the ADU be placed behind the current property. I have 2.5 acres, and that's not a problem. I can put it way back there. But the concern I have is one of your other suggestions is that the driveway connect to the main house, if I've heard you correctly. I, in no way, shape, or form, want to try and connect my driveway, which comes straight off of the street, into my home, because my garage is underneath the house. I, in no way, shape, or form, want to make that driveway part of a driveway to a possible rental unit that I have in the back of the property. So I would want to be able to put a separate driveway in the back. Septic systems. I actually spoke with someone today, a septic designer, and my home septic system is designed for a home my size. I was surprised to find out that it's past its useful age. It's over 20 years old. But the septic system has barely been used in the last 20 years. The previous owner only came up on the weekends or periodically with family get-togethers. And in the last 8 years since my wife and I have owned the home, we've really only lived in the house together 2 of the 8 years. I lived there for 5 years by myself while she commuted to Boston for her job. So the septic, I think the loading within this, if I'm not mistaken, the state's regulations would come into play as far as the amount of property you had for the septic loading to add the ADU. The designer I spoke with today said he would recommend that I either completely replace the current septic system and put in a 5 or 6 bedroom septic system, or add a separate septic system for a 2-bedroom home if we were able to build an ADU. So there are a lot of things to consider, and you have a lot of good things to consider. And I appreciate you listening to me today, and I look forward to being part of the discussion in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know who I am.
Okay, you need to talk. Yeah,
Detached.
sorry.
So we already have no regulations on short-term rentals here. So now we're going to build more short-term rentals that we won't regulate. I don't know about you, but I went on the apps in the last week or so. I was flabbergasted at the number of short-term rentals in neighborhoods that I didn't even know were, I thought people were full year-round residents. It's a mushrooming problem. So you're opening that door, but we don't have anybody regulating any of that stuff. So you do the detached, you're going to have more short-term rentals, as this gentleman just alluded to. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'm sorry, Maggie.
I just have one question for Mike Hodder. When you were looking at other towns and their detached short-term rentals. Did you gather information on how many people are applying for that per year? Tabitha said we only had 4 for the attached. I just love to know what the order of magnitude is in other towns and how many they have.
I did not do that, no.
Might be a question that would be asked at the public forum. How many are there in other towns, like Tuftonboro or Alton? I'm curious.
How many detached, accessory?
Right, and how much has that grown since they began permitting them?
That would be pretty recent.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
because we haven't had this regulation for a
right.
while.
Okay,
No, the state rule about ADUs is very recent
for attached.
for all of
But
the above.
other
Okay.
towns may have allowed rental units
Yeah, before.
prior
Okay.
to.
Okay, just, it would be helpful to know that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, Tavis, one of the things that was on our list to work on this year was housing and bringing all of them together in one chapter, in addition to looking at all of them. So how are we doing on that?
We're making general progress on it, and once it becomes clearer from the board what the anticipated outcome is, it can come together rather quickly.
Oh, okay, well, what do you mean the outcome? I mean, we've talked about
It's
housing, putting them all into one chapter, and then redoing, and we've got inclusionary zoning. I mean, we've had some discussion about the nonprofit affordable. And so
I can put together a combined draft for the next meeting if you'd like.
I thought the hangup was going to be on the matter of density, that it would be
Right.
easy to combine all of the current ordinances into one general ordinance, but the question of density would remain unanswered.
It would in fact remain unanswered, but I can put together a compilation ordinance that takes all of the 4 separate ones and puts it into one
Yeah, because
with the same density.
That's what
Right, yeah.
we discussed last Tuesday.
Right. Yeah, I think that we need to get going on that because it's, kind of a big project and it's going to take us a while, I think, just judging from the discussion tonight on accessory dwellings, so. Okay, minutes, April 5th, 2022. Anybody have any issues?
I don't know who asked about the snow load and removal, but it wasn't me. It might have been you.
Where are you?
On page 1, Vaughn Dugan asked about the snow load and removal. I didn't either.
I asked about it too.
Okay.
Could have been me.
Julie?
Julie asked about that.
Page 1, Julie, on snow.
Yep, 4th from the bottom.
Any other issues? And entertain a motion to
Move to approve?
approve these with the corrections. Okay, I'll second the motion. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. All right, that's it for now.
Move to adjourn.
Second?
Thank you. Okay, all in favor? Aye.
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 Hey, Tavis, did